government has created weather tampering techniques so that the New World Order will be able to starve millions of Americans and to control the rest. Would you explain what you were trying to say?
Well, what I was trying to say is exactly what I said. There is weather control techniques. We have a complete package on that, which I did not bring, but I certainly will see to it that it is brought in for the record. Number one, the entire patents on the equipment. Number two, Senator Claiborne Pell's complete statement and story of his own, that not only does it exist, but that we even utilize it as far back as the Vietnam War. You might want to touch base with Senator Pell.
I just want to repeat before you turn to
yes, but we do have all that information.
You're saying the government has created weather tampering techniques so that the, quote, New World Order will be able to starve millions of Americans
worldwide.
Millions of Americans, and to control the rest.
Yes, sir, and that's my belief. As bizarre as that sounds, when if somebody had told me that that equipment even existed 10 years ago, I would have thought they were nuts, sir. And at this point in time, we have all the documents to prove it. And if you think that 85 tornadoes takes place in the middle of our growing area by simultaneous accident, I'm sorry. With the equipment that's already set up internationally, and as bizarre as that is, it is proven and documented. We will supply you with those documents. As bizarre as that is, I would say that weather wars, and this is quoting actually Senator Claiborne Pell himself, that they are the greatest weapon ever created in the world, and that's the Senator's own statement. So yes, I do stand on that.
Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, sir.
Khaled, thank you very much for moderating this session, and I turn it over to you, and I will return in about 3 minutes.
So our next speaker is Dr. Rosalind Peterson. She's the California president and co-founder of the Agriculture Defense Coalition, formed in 2006 to protect agricultural crop production from uncontrolled experimental weather modification programs. A very interesting topic, for a non-specialized person like myself. But also very interesting in her CV that we have with you is also her extensive efforts to protect drinking water supplies from toxic chemical contamination in Martinez, California. That's a very interesting topic, of course, and I was actually wondering myself whether you can tackle whether the same experiments that you're holding in California could be extended to other world countries, particularly poor and developed countries like where we come from. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman. It is a pleasure to be here to speak with all of you today. One of the things that I would like to say is that we are in a global drumbeat right at the moment talking about climate change and global warming. One of the things that is affected by climate change is agriculture. But some of what we are seeing is man-made, but man-made in a different way than you may guess. Weather modification programs, experimental ones done by private companies, done by the United States government, done by states across the United States are underway. There's more than 50 of them in operation across the United States. All of these impact agriculture because they change the microclimates needed for agriculture to survive. None of these programs that I know of today, and this is all public record, are available at any time with oversight, agricultural oversight or public oversight. These programs impact agriculture, and there are programs around the world, international corporations are modifying our weather all the time, and they're modifying it in ways that cover thousands and thousands of square miles. Most of it is chemically altered, so that what happens is that we are putting chemicals, ground-based chemicals that are shot into the air, or chemicals coming from airplanes that change and modify our weather. So one of the things that I'm concerned about and that we need to address in the future is how these programs are impacting microclimates needed for our crops to survive and needed for pollination. If we change the growing season, the pollinators may not survive, and also our crops, our flowers, and our tree crops may not get the pollination needed. So one of my areas is looking at this situation to see if we can begin to put under control experimental and other types of weather modification programs. The other issue is that a lot of times we're talking about mitigation for climate change. It's rather an undefined term at this period of time. And so what happens is that many times we're talking about artificially putting chemicals like sulfur or particulates into the atmosphere in what they call geoengineering schemes to reduce and help the planet, supposedly, but help the planet to not go through such a tremendous global climate change and to mitigate global warming. However, the incidence of putting chemicals into our atmosphere is going to change and impact agricultural crop production. And if you take and you put up into our skies chemicals to reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the earth, you are going to begin to reduce crop production. Studies at the University of Illinois on corn crop production show reductions. Without the process of photosynthesis, whereby plants from direct sunlight gain the energy to grow, to produce crops, we are going to find ourselves, if we mitigate in that direction, impacting the crop production not only here in the United States, but worldwide. One of the things that is impacting crop production right now in the United States and reducing photosynthesis and also impacting the ability of solar power panels to generate the type of power that they should is persistent jet contrails. NASA talks about persistent jet contrails as exacerbating global warming because they trap warmth in the atmosphere when they produce cirrus and man-made clouds. NASA also talks about that that these aircraft leaving persistent contrails are changing our climate. And when they change our climate to the degree that one jet can leave a persistent jet contrail, which will spread across our skies from what this picture up here on my left on the screen looks like, which is a trail left by a jet, that trail can expand to 4,000 kilometers and last for 20 hours. This was unheard of in the early 60s and the 70s, and it wasn't until the late 1980s that there was a change and we started to have persistent jet contrails that persist. NASA studies show that part of our global warming problem could be attributed to these types of contrails and the jets that leave them. So one of the issues as we go through is, how do you like your skies, natural or man-made? And right now we are making man-made clouds, and this is trapping warmth in our atmosphere. The climate change that is produced by these jets, not all jets, mostly some non-commercial, but what happens to our skies is that we start to see the changes. The man-made clouds do trap the warmth and they increase the humidity. This allows for pests to proliferate, diseases, molds, mildews, funguses, and viruses. This is a man-made cloud, ladies and gentlemen, and these pictures I took myself over Northern California, and this is a burst. This is where a jet left a huge plume, and then this turned in at the end of it to a burst. And this is not normal, never seen before in our county historically, and I was born and raised there. This is another picture showing the jet trail just before the burst. This is our skies, and I want you to know that what you're seeing now, a lot of times many scientists know, especially at NASA and in other areas, that the skies that we're seeing are not normal cloud formations. These are man-made. And what happens as we reduce the amount of sunlight in a form of global dimming, we reduce the solar power with these type of clouds, and we reduce photosynthesis, which is going to impact agriculture. The pictures look odd. The formations don't look like normal clouds that people have seen before historically. This is another type of man-made cloud, and what we have done and what you're seeing here is we have the photographs from the times that the jet leaves the first trail as a thin, spindly trail to where they form into these different types of cloud formations. All of you can start looking up and seeing this. what happens is that there are experiments, and there's a color, you can see some color in this photograph. And part of what we're doing also is we're sending up canisters. The United States government, NASA, the U.S. Air Force, is sending up canisters into the atmosphere filled with chemicals to modify and experiment with our ionosphere. And when we modify and experiment with our ionosphere up here, we create experiments which they can see through these persistent jet contrails as they stay in the sky for long periods of time, and they can watch the experiments. The type of chemicals they are using are aluminum, barium, strontium, and these canisters are sent up on rockets, and what they do is they superheat the canisters to create experiments in our atmosphere. The experiments can give you colorful auroras, which they talk about as being wonderful. Many times people think that the auroras in Alaska and the ones we see are normal, but there's beginning to be more and more seen across the United States and elsewhere where aluminum, trimethyl aluminum experiments to make clouds are beginning to impact us. The reason I am concerned for agriculture is that none of these experiments have any public oversight nor agricultural oversight. Our drinking water is impacted because the chemicals are now beginning to show up in our drinking water. In California, the State Department of Health drinking water tests were examined between 1970 and this year, and we found unusual spiking in barium, aluminum, strontium, magnesium, calcium, manganese, and all of these spiked at the same time in various drinking water supplies across the state of California and also in Arizona. So what's happening with these atmospheric tests is that aluminum, as one example, gets into, with increased pollution and acid rain, gets into the root systems of our crop trees and our trees, and it looks like the trees are dying of drought. But they're not. What happens is that the root systems can no longer absorb the water and the nutrients needed to survive. Many of our forests in Redding, California and other areas are dying. The oak trees, the redwood trees, the Douglas fir across the United States, many areas. We believe that these trees are impacted because they cannot absorb enough water because aluminum is going into their root systems. Also, molds, mildew, and fungus from warmer temperatures produced by persistent jet contrails are also allowing pests and molds to proliferate, also impacting tree health and crop health. The skies that you see up here, it is important to note, have a white haze to them. When crossing the United States 2 days ago, we saw this man-made produced haze all the way across the United States. There were a few real clouds. We saw the persistent jet contrails from the jet windows, and the skies in the white haze looked a lot like this. So one of the things that we need to really look at is that jet fuel emissions contaminate our air, much as automobile exhaust. They know from scientific studies back in the 1970s that they deplete beneficial ozone in the atmosphere by releasing nitric acid. So one of the things that we need to look at is the impact of just jet fuel and just the emissions from jets as well. I want to go on and talk briefly about a couple of issues here that I think are important for everyone to realize. If we don't look at the problems that we are creating, the atmospheric testing programs, in other words, the jet contrails that are warming our climate, and we say to ourselves, we want to geoengineer something else. We want to add more particulates to help global warming or to stop climate change. What we're going to have is we're going to have a pea soup up there of chemicals which are going to be detrimental to our health. It is much better to take the EPA model of the 1970s, where the Environmental Protection Agency was designed to put in regulations to reduce the pollution at its source, to reduce and put caps on how much pollution corporations, cars, automobiles were putting into the atmosphere. One of the things that we're talking about as mitigation is to go into geoengineering plans which add more chemicals to our atmosphere, which are going to get into our drinking water supplies, which are going to get into our soils, which are going to impact our trees. Our trees across the United States, many of them in many areas, especially Mendocino Lake and Sonoma County, are dying. They are not healthy as they used to be. And this problem, having traveled across the United States into some other areas, seeing the pictures coming in from across the United States and other countries, we're finding that there's beginning to be an impact from all of these programs and all the chemicals in our skies. And so one of the things we need to think about and work for is reducing pollution. Alan Buckman from the California State Department in Fish and Game talked about microbes, and they're important to the environment. We have at our disposal already some technologies and already the wherewithal to begin to make the planet more healthy and to put it into a different perspective. But if we go to the geoengineering schemes that are waiting in the wings, thousands of them, to put the particulates up and sulfur, then we are going to be in trouble with agriculture across the United States and around the world. It is time that we look at some different solutions that are already here, and it's time that we look at what's happening in our skies and say we don't need to add any more chemicals, we are doing enough. And what these experiments in our skies are doing with atmospheric heating and testing, we don't know, but the chemicals are showing up in our drinking water. So in closing, I would like to say to all of you and to encourage you to know that just what I showed you today is beginning to impact crop production in the United States. And we're seeing higher UV radiation that is burning the tips of our trees and our plants. We see the molds and mildews growing here. And we see all of this. And we hope that all of you will consider before you think of mitigation and just go forward with some of the plans that are being sold to you as almost a cap and trade situation, where a corporation like Planktos decides to put iron dust into the Galapagos Islands area. This is a proposal, may have already started, and to create algae blooms. And yes, they're saying, yes, we're going to help the environment because we're going to create these algae blooms for more oxygen. But what happens is it's going to impact the marine life in those areas. As a geoengineering plan, it is going to be sold, the credits for this, the supposed benefits, is to be sold as credits to people who want to pollute more. And here's the really awful twist to this, in my opinion, is if we sell pollution credits to polluters to ask them so that they can pollute more, we're only going to add more to our climate change and to our global warming processes. We have to say, no, we don't want money market schemes that are going to go into the ocean and change something possibly to the detriment of our oceans or our air in order to sell credits to someone who wants to pollute more. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a consideration for all of you when you start to talk about caps and trade, when you start to talk about geoengineering plans, because we don't need a money market scheme. We need to have and use the microbes available to us, the science available to us to reduce the pollution that we're putting into the atmosphere, and we need a new direction, and I think that this might be a good one. So I hope that all of you will consider what I have to say today, and I want to thank you once again for listening.
Jean Manning is a journalist who stumbled into a strange world when she started asking questions about alternative energy sources and heard the story of an early 20th century inventor named Nikola Tesla.
Tesla is almost a cult hero and an overlooked genius, and he has so many inventions that are at the basis of technologies that we have today.
She went to a conference on Tesla and had a close encounter with a mysterious scientific researcher who became her deep throat, her Mr. X.
He sent me a file of materials about the Bernard Eastlund patent.
About a month ago, the U.S. Patent Office granted a patent to a Houston-based scientist, Dr. Bernard Eastlund, for an invention which Dr. Eastlund says could be used to change the weather. Dr. Eastlund says the invention could also be used to disrupt communications all over the world and might be used to destroy or deflect a missile attack.
The Eastlund patents had the ring of the mad scientist aspect of Tesla. Tesla talked about this Tesla shield around the planet and talked about particle beam weaponry, something called a death ray.
Death ray? Gene wasn't sure where all this was leading until Mr. X called again.
And he said, the maniacs are actually going to do it up in Alaska.
Mr. X's maniacs were in the U.S. Pentagon, and he was convinced they were conspiring to build Bernard Eastlund's Sky Zapper under the guise of a nice little research project deep in the Alaskan bush called HARP.
The basic concept is to build a very large antenna, then to utilize a large amount of power and to beam those radio waves up into the upper atmosphere.
Have you approached the Pentagon with this invention?
Yes, and what I'm not at liberty to tell you is the details of what that interaction has been.
The word spread through the Alaskan bush, and soon a band of suspicious Alaskans set out to warn people about what they saw as the U.S. military's secret agenda.
What you have with HARP is sort of the universal hammer for geophysical warfare.
Nick Begich is the chief conspiracy theorist.
So when did you know that you were onto something?
I think as soon as I saw the references to Tesla's work, and when I read Bernard Eastlund's original patents, I realized that what we really had here in Alaska was a prototype for a ground-based Star Wars weapon system.
HARP is a non-classified project run not by Bernard Eastlund, but by the U.S. Army and Navy. The official HARP story is told by one man, John Heckscher.
It consists of several types of transmitting instruments and numerous scientific instruments that study the natural ionosphere and the ionosphere that has been perturbed by the instruments that we are building.
The ionosphere is a sea of electrically charged particles in the upper atmosphere, and the instrument is a powerful radio wave transmitter.
Does it have any military applications?
The site itself is strictly a scientific research site. Perhaps the outcome of some of the science, perhaps some of the results could be applied in the military to military systems.
Just a little physics project? Jim Roderick isn't buying it. He's been gunning for the real goods on HARP, and his weapon is the internet.
The military is incapable of doing pure science. Science is conducted by them for application in weapon systems, for no other reasons.
From his shack in the middle of an Alaskan village, Jim and his co-conspirators around the globe have been tapping into databases. They've dredged up hundreds of long-buried scientific reports and even some internal documents from the military. They call it the world's first techno-protest, and they did it all on the military's own baby, the net.
Plans for HARP activities correlate with projections of what can be done in the Eastlund patents. It's that simple.
So it's not a coincidence?
It's not a coincidence.
Well, I hate to disagree with you, but it's not his patent that we're building. Superficially, yes, they send energy up into the ionosphere, but the Eastlund patents require huge, prodigious, in fact, amounts of power, like 100 billion watts.
Remember that number, 100 billion watts. You'll hear it again later.
HARP requires only 3 million watts.
There is a paper trail leading us back to Eastland.
No, there is not. There is no paper trail that I'm aware of that's leading back to Eastland. Eastland used to be an employee of the company which is building HARP, but that's pure coincidence.
Is it also a coincidence that the tiny company that owned Eastland's patents was later swallowed up by an enormous military intelligence firm called E-Systems?
2.1 billion in annual sales, 1.8 billion of that with a B was to military intelligence groups, CIA, NSA, and others. And of that, 800 million were black projects, so secret that even the United States Congress didn't know what they were.
E-Systems was then swallowed up by Raytheon Corporation. It too specializes in super secret contracts with the Pentagon.
Why would Raytheon be so excited about this? Well, it's a ground-based Star Wars weapon prototype. For them, it represents potentially billions and billions of dollars.
So how would you describe this world of E-Systems and Raytheon and HARP?
Dark.
There's a lot of people around here that have a really lot of strange ideas, and I think many of them are pretty bizarre.
Michelle Angbrittson keeps the HARP computers from freezing up in between visits from the military scientists.
Do you know, do you understand what they're doing here when the scientists come in?
You mean when the scientists come in and shoot the beams up? Yeah, they're shooting the beams up, and I think that heats a little small space in the ionosphere, and then you've got guys that are sitting on computers. You've got people putting up weather poles that measure weather and everything like that. There's something spooky going on here.
There have been claims made by some scientists that you could heat up the ionosphere and affect local weather.
If you were to do Eastland patents, I have no doubt that's the case.
Claims are being made that it could disrupt global communications.
Global?
That it could shut down another country's communication system and enhance your own.
Not HARP. Not HARP in
as it is
Alaska.
now. No. But you couldn't disable any systems?
Those that use, if the systems used a path which was accessible to the HARP beam, yes.
Starting to sound like Eastland's invention to you? Well, remember, John Heckscher says HARP has nowhere near the power levels Eastland talked about.
It seems like this entire thing has been a matter of disinformation.
Eric Nashland understands the military. He spent 15 years in the service as a radio engineer. He knows deception.
It came to our attention that there was a document, a technical memorandum, I think it was 195 or something like that. And reading right in the front of it, they said that, bottom line, although this is here, it does not constitute publication.
It doesn't exist.
It basically doesn't exist. So it was kind of like, wow, here's the document that doesn't exist. We're talking several hundred pages of document that doesn't exist on a project that is completely unclassified and open to the public.
We got it through friendly folks in the right spots, but it really lays out, these are notes from a conference that really break down where they were going to use this technology and how this technology was going to be applied.
Remember the 100 billion watts debate? Well, for Nick Begich, this document was pay dirt.
And in the document that we uncovered, the actual desired level of these researchers is 100 billion watts, and there we're talking something closer to the order of what Bernard Eastland envisioned.
You must be familiar with Technical Memorandum 195, which talks about a desired level of 100 billion watts.
Which memorandum?
Technical Memorandum 195.
I'm not familiar with that number.
Well, it's about 600 pages. And you may not acknowledge it because it hasn't been published, but it exists. I've seen it.
I don't know what Technical Memorandum 195 is, because I haven't seen it.
This is a published document. It's not released. And it's the word games that John Heckscher plays and the word games the United States military plays, and it's the word games they continue to play, and those are the things that need to end.
Zap incoming missiles, disrupt global communications, and engineer the weather. And ready? There's one more. Some people believe the technology being tested here could be used for sinister projects involving humans. Radio waves messing around with people's brain waves. And guess what? The military denies this one, too.
The human mind is subject to being affected by radio frequency energy, and that's what this device is.
In other words, you can move the moods of large populations using this kind of technology.
So now we have not just maniacs in the Pentagon, but a bunch of Dr. Strangeloves? Pretty weird stuff. But scientists have been experimenting with radio frequencies on animals' brains for decades. And the military has followed it all very closely, especially once it found out the Russians were onto it.
It was all kept a deep, dark secret by the two superpowers.
Back in the 60s, the Soviets began zapping the American embassy in Moscow with a low-frequency beam. No one knows for sure what they were up to, but one theory is that they were trying to mess with people's central nervous systems. And one report did say the diplomats got depressed a lot. And hey, just think of all the nifty applications against the enemy. Why blow people up when you can drive them crazy?
From documents dating back into the early 80s, we see that the military had discussed the possibilities of mind control through radio frequency energy. The possibility is there. The military has studied it.
A 1982 Air Force report called radio frequency energy a major new research initiative and said that RF can, quote, disrupt normal purposeful behavior. A 1987 military report called for more research on RF energy as a non-lethal weapon, while pointing out that most of the existing technology is classified. And sure enough, in 1993, there was a big conference at Johns Hopkins University. Here, the entire conference was classified. But the agenda wasn't, and weapons using extremely low radio frequencies, or ELFs, were listed as a very attractive option. Is it just a coincidence that there's been all of this talk and that HAARP will be experimenting with this? Is that all just coincidence?
I believe the ability of ELF to affect the mind is a side issue for us. It may be real. I can't say.
It's been exceedingly difficult to find information on what is supposed to be a major new initiative of the military. All we see is HAARP.
Well, then I'm being kept in the dark, if that's the case.
The question is, could they, would they? And we believe they can, and we believe they will. Somewhere at some point, all of this technology merges at some level within the Pentagon, and it happens to be in Alaska, and it happens to be now.
It isn't just conspiracy theorists who are concerned about HAARP. In January of 1999, the European Union called the project of global concern and passed a resolution calling for more information on its health and environmental risks. Despite those concerns, officials at HAARP insist the project is nothing more sinister than a radio science research facility.
So the radiation management might work. So conceptually, it's simple. The Earth is in some kind of balance where we absorb sunlight and we radiate it away as infrared. And what CO2 is doing by warming the climate is making it harder for that infrared to get out. If you reflect away a little more sunlight by adding reflective aerosols, tiny particles, say, to the upper atmosphere. And how do you do that? You could do it with aircraft, for example. The doing it is probably not the hard part, but you could use aircraft or other methods to deliver literally tons or millions of tons of very small particles to the upper atmosphere. One way, sort of spraying them out at a high altitude. Correct. And one thing this does is to mimic what volcanoes do, at least in some crude way. So large volcanoes put sulfur into the upper atmosphere, and those cool the planet.
Mr. President, honored delegates, ladies and gentlemen, we shall propose further cooperative efforts between all the nations in weather prediction and eventually in weather control. Remarks the President to the National Academy of Science from Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., October 22nd, 1963. And third, there is the atmosphere itself, the atmosphere in which we live and breathe and which makes life on this planet possible. Scientists have studied the atmosphere for many decades, but its problems continue to defy us. The reasons for our limited progress are obvious.
Weather cannot be easily reproduced and observed in the laboratory. It must therefore be studied in all of its violence wherever it has its way. Here is an oceanography. New scientific tools have become available with modern computers, rockets, and satellites. The time is ripe to harness a variety of disciplines for a concerted attack. And even more than oceanography, the atmospheric sciences require worldwide observation and hence international cooperation. Some of our most successful international efforts have involved the study of the atmosphere. We all know that the World Meteorological Organization has been effective in this field. It is now developing a worldwide weather system to which nations the world over can make their contribution. Such cooperative undertakings can challenge the world's best efforts for decades to come. Fourth, I would mention a problem which I know has greatly concerned many of you. That is our responsibility to control the effects of our own scientific experiments. For as science investigates the natural environment, it also modifies it. And that modification may have incalculable consequences for evil as well as for good. In the past, the problem of conservation has been mainly the problem of human waste, of natural resources, of their destruction. But science has the power for the first time in history now to undertake experiments with premeditation which can irreversibly alter our biological and physical environment on a global scale. The problem is difficult because it is hard to know in advance whether the cumulative effects of a particular experiment will help or harm mankind. In the case of nuclear testing, the world is satisfied that radioactive contamination involves unnecessary risks, and we are all heartened that more than 100 nations have joined to outlaw testing in environments where the effects most directly threaten mankind. In other fields, we may be less sure. We must, for example, balance the gains of weather modification against the hazards of protracted drought or storm. The government has the clear responsibility to weigh the importance of large-scale experiments to the advance of knowledge or to national security against the possibility of adverse and destructive effects. The scientific community must assist the government in arriving at rational judgments and interpreting these issues to the public. To deal with this problem, we have worked out formal procedures within the government to assure expert review before potentially risky experiments are undertaken. And we will make every effort to publish the data needed to permit open examination and discussion of proposed experiments by the scientific community before they are authorized. If science is to press ahead in the four fields that I have mentioned, if it is to continue to grow in effectiveness and productivity, our society must provide scientific inquiry the necessary means of sustenance. We must in short support it. Military and space needs, for example, offer little justification for much work in what Joseph Henry called abstract science. Though such fundamental inquiry is essential to the future technological vitality of industry and government alike, it is usually more difficult to comprehend than applied activity, and as a consequence, often seems harder to justify to the Congress, to the executive branch, and to the people. But if basic research is to be properly regarded, it must be better understood. I ask you to reflect on this problem and on the means by which in the years to come, our society can assure continuing backing to fundamental research in the life sciences, the physical sciences, the social sciences, on natural resources, on agriculture, on protection against pollution and erosion. Together, the scientific community, the government, industry, and education must work out the way to nourish American science in all its power and vitality. Even this year, we have already seen in the first actions of the House of Representatives some failure of support for important areas of research which must depend on the national government. I'm hopeful that the Senate of the United States will restore these funds. What it needs, of course, is a wider understanding by the country as a whole of the value of this work, which has been so sustained by so many of you. I would not close, however, on a gloomy note. For ours is a century of scientific conquest and scientific triumph. If scientific discovery has not been an unalloyed blessing, if it has only conferred on mankind the power not only to create, but also to annihilate, it has at the same time provided humanity with a supreme challenge and a supreme testing. If the challenge and the testing are too much for humanity, then we're all doomed. But I believe that the future can be bright, and I believe it can be certain. Man is still the master of his own fate, and I believe that the power of science and the responsibility of science have offered mankind a new opportunity, not only for intellectual growth, but for moral discipline, not only for the acquisition of knowledge, but for the strengthening of our nerve and our will. We are bound to grope for a time as we grapple with problems without precedent in human history. But wisdom is the child of experience. In the years since man unlocked the power stored within the atom, the world has made progress, halting but effective, towards bringing that power under human control.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world. And ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Fourth, I would mention a problem which I know has greatly concerned many of you. That is our responsibility to control the effects of our own scientific experiments. For as science investigates the natural environment, it also modifies it. And that modification may have incalculable consequences for evil as well as for good.
Tropical storm Harvey is pummeling southern
Live
Texas.
here in Houston, where Harvey's rains keep coming.
It's not the initial impact, but the flooding.
Record-shattering rain, massive flooding, families stranded.
Waters keep rising.
This is just the beginning.
Hi, if anybody's out there and can hear us, please help.
I need a rescue. These are 3 kids, no food or water.
Do we have anyone in the Friendship area?
Where's that humble address at? What's the humble address where they're trying to let the boats get in?
There's been a report of another 5 foot of water about to pour out of Baker Dam.
In Normandy, we need help. Families are going under with the
We
current.
need strong
The boats are capsizing.
in Normandy, families are on these boats.
They need boats out there.
They saying a white truck went under the water. So and I'm like, well, it can't be him because he into my house. Also, I kept calling his wife, dialing 911, and no response. I kept calling him, no response.
Hi, ma'am. This is Texas Game Warden Carmen Rickle. It's my understanding that you guys have called to be evacuated from your residence. Is that correct? Do you know the condition of the water around the house?
I don't know yet.
Stand by. We're going to try to get somebody out there to help you.
I mean, lasers? Really? To change the weather?
That's right. Well, as Mark Twain once famously said, everyone complains about the weather, but no one ever does anything about it. Well, instead of doing a rain dance, we physicists are firing trillion-watt lasers into the sky to actually precipitate rain clouds and actually bring down lightning bolts. This is potentially a game changer. When you have water vapor and you have dust particles or ice crystals, you can precipitate rain. It condenses around the seeds. These seeds can also be created by laser beams. By firing trillion-watt lasers, you rip apart the electrons, creating what are called ions, and these ions act like seeds, like dust particles, bringing down rain and even lightning. Katie, go ahead.
Well, this fascinates me in part because, too, I remember reading the stories that China had used this during the Olympics, that the USSR had used this after Chernobyl to create rain clouds.
Even in the 60s, the CIA used this to bring down monsoons during the Vietnam War, to wash out the Viet Cong.